Today we are here to honor the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a man who is known worldwide for his fight against racial inequality and for social justice. Dr. King was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. Many of you may not know this, but his birth name was actually Michael. His father's birth name was also Michael. His father was a minister in a Baptist church in Atlanta. In 1934, his father went to Berlin to attend the Baptist World Alliance Conference. He was deeply concerned with what he saw was happening under the reign of Adolf Hitler. He and the other ministers condemned anti-Semitism. They were deeply concerned about Nazism. As he toured Germany, he learned of a 16th century monk and a theology professor named Martin Luther, who played a significant role in Reformation. When Michael Sr. arrived back home to Atlanta, he changed his name to Martin Luther King Sr. He also changed his son's name to Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. was 28 at the time his name was changed. Martin Luther King Jr. not only shared his father's name, but shared his father's passion for equality and justice. As we honor Dr. King, please keep in mind that his work is timeless in that racial injustice preceded him and extends beyond his death. He paid the ultimate sacrifice, his life, in his fight for racial equality. Ironically, this man of peace was taken from us through a senseless act of violence. His murderer hoped to silence Dr. King. He failed. As we are here today, we are proof that his murderer did not succeed. In fact, his murder energized others to continue Dr. King's fight. We will continue to stand with Dr. King in his pursuit for what is right. Dr. King's mission is just as important today as it was in April 1963 when he wrote a letter from the Birmingham jail. Let me briefly give you some background about this powerful letter. Dr. King was arrested for engaging in nonviolent protests against racial segregation and inequality in Birmingham. While sitting in jail, he read a letter in the newspaper penned by 8 white clergymen who called the protests unwisely and untimely. They also condemned outsiders who were leading the protests. Clearly, this was directed toward Dr. King, who was not a Birmingham resident. Sitting in jail with a great deal of time on his hands, Dr. King decided to write a reply to their letter, which is now famously known as a letter from Birmingham jail. He began the letter by recognizing the clergymen as people of genuine goodwill. This was brilliant. He set a non-adversarial tone from the onset of his letter. Rather than fight with ugliness, he chose grace and dignity. In his letter, he shared reasons that he was in Birmingham, including he had been invited to be in Birmingham, and 2, that he was there because injustice was in Birmingham. Dr. King explained that civil disobedience was, at times, necessary. Laws were not protecting Negro citizens. Thus, peaceful protests were needed for change. He reminded the clergymen that the acts committed by Hitler were lawful. While Hitler's atrocities were lawful, that did not make them morally right. Drawing on Dr. King's idea of civil disobedience, we can understand the need for this even today. What are those suffering from injustice expected to do? Are they expected to continue to be harmed and allow their children and future generations to be subjected to similar harms? The answer is simple. The answer is no. They are tasked with using their voices and their bodies as a way to dissent. As a nation, we must stand beside them and listen to their voices and plead with them for change. As a criminal justice professor, I have spent decades teaching about the formal criminal justice system. Admittedly, what I taught was how the system works, but failed to explain how it really works. Laws are man-made. Consequently, they represent those in power, specifically created from the lens of a white man. As Dr. King recognized, laws did not protect Negroes. This means that the only power afforded to minorities was to take to the streets and engage in civil disobedience. I share with my own students that disobedience is not a bad thing. It can bring about necessary change, but one must engage in disobedience in a non-violent manner. Remember Rosa Parks? For her to peacefully refuse to give up her seat, she was breaking the law. Her law-breaking behavior led to positive social change. Now, African Americans lawfully can sit on a public bus and not be forced to give up a seat to a person of the right color. Now back to Dr. King's letter. Dr. King closed his letter by apologizing for taking up so much of the clergyman's time, as his letter was long. He explained that had he been sitting in a comfortable place, the letter would have been much shorter. The irony of this should not be lost on any of us. Even when they thought jailing him would silence him, it actually afforded him the time to write such a powerful message, which has now been read and heard worldwide from one generation to the next. Dr. King discusses miscarriages of justice in his letter. He notes that the clergymen condemned the nonviolent protesters, but never condemned the police who engaged in violence against the Negro community. In fact, he argued that they commended the Birmingham police for maintaining order. He shared that he doubted that they would commend them had they seen their dogs sinking their teeth into unarmed, nonviolent Negroes, their ugly and inhumane treatment of Negroes in the jail, or watch the police push and curse old Negro women and young Negro girls, or slap and kick old Negro men and young Negro boys. He wrote that he cannot join them in praise for the Birmingham Police Department. Like Dr. King, I cannot praise any criminal justice actor who abuses innocent men and women, resulting in harms that go beyond my comprehension. And like Dr. King, when I see a miscarriage of justice, I call for action. My work over the past 6 years has been fighting miscarriages of justice, particularly in the area of wrongful convictions. In order for you to best understand wrongful convictions, I must humanize the wrongly convicted. To do this, let me introduce some wrongly convicted persons. In 2016, I had the opportunity to have two incredible warriors speak at a wrongful conviction forum I hosted at our university. These two had been wrongly convicted in Illinois. They were the victims of torture at the hands of Chicago Police Commander John Burge's Midnight Crew. 120 men claimed to have been tortured by Burge and his crew. 110 of the 120 are African American men. These men are now known as the Chicago torture survivors. Stanley Rice had been hung from the ceiling and beaten, among other abuses. He finally falsely confessed, landing him in prison for 31 years for a rape he did not commit. Mark Clemens suffered genital trauma during his torture. No longer able to withstand the abuse, he confessed to crimes he did not commit. He was 16 years old. He would spend the next 28 years in prison for arson and murders that he did not commit. Other African American men reported being beaten, suffocated, burned by cigarettes and radiators, and also shocked. Many are still languishing in prison and need to be freed. So what happened to Burge? He was found guilty of perjury, not abuse. He was sentenced to 4.5 years in federal prison. I ask you, is this what justice should look like? I also want to introduce you to Tim Cole. In 1985, a young white college student had been raped. She provided a description of a black male. 2 weeks after the rape, Tim, a 24-year-old Army veteran studying business at Texas Tech, was leaving a pizza parlor when a female detective spoke to him. She thought he resembled the composite and asked for his information. The next day, a detective went to his apartment. They took a picture of him. They showed the victim a photo lineup in the six-pack. Tim's picture was the only Polaroid, while the others were mugshot photos. Not surprising, the victim pointed him out in the photo lineup, and then again, not surprising, she pointed him out in the physical lineup. Clearly, she was actually choosing the photo that she had been shown and not the actual perpetrator. Tim had told the police he had been home studying and his brother had friends over that night. His brother and his friends each shared the same information. Equally important, the victim shared that the rapist had continuously smoked during the assault. Tim explained that he had asthma and could not smoke. While Tim was not a smoker, and he was at home with his brother and others at the day and time of the rape, those facts did not matter, as a jury convicted him and found him guilty. I spoke to Tim's brother, Corey Session, the other day and told him that I would be here honoring Dr. King and would speak of his letter from Birmingham jail. Corey asked me to mention that as Tim was sitting in the Lubbock County Jail, he also wrote a letter. He wrote a letter to their sister Karen, who was a law student at the time of his arrest. She wanted to quit law school due to the harassment the family had endured and all the negative media attention surrounding Tim's case. Tim wrote a reply to her, encouraging her to stay in law school. He ended his letter to Karen with the following quote, "I still believe in the justice system, even if it does not believe in me." Tim was given a 25-year sentence. He had been offered a plea deal to which he denied, as he would not admit to a crime that he did not commit. Sadly, he died 13 years into his incarceration from complications from asthma. His quote is on the historical marker at his grave. Years later, DNA proved that Tim could not have been the rapist, and 10 years after his death, he was the first person to be posthumously exonerated in Texas. Today, a 13-foot statue memorializing Tim Cole has been erected across from Texas Tech, where Tim was a student. The statue embodies Tim's principles and the imperfections of the criminal justice system. Like Tim Cole, Yusef Salaam was wrongly convicted of rape. At the age of 15, he, along with 4 other minority teenagers known as the Central Park Five, were arrested for the 1989 beating and rape of a white female jogger. This case sparked outrage throughout the country. America wanted vengeance at any cost, including locking up innocent young boys. After spending almost 7 years in prison, Yusef Salaam was exonerated as DNA pointed to the real attacker, a 17-year-old boy who acted alone. I spoke with Dr. Yusef Salaam recently about my talk today. Dr. Salaam was awarded an honorary doctorate in 2014, and he received the President's Lifetime Achievement Award in 2016 from President Barack Obama. In May 2019, Netflix released the limited series titled When They See Us, based on the true story of Salaam and the other members of the Central Park Five. Dr. Salaam shared that Dr. King would remind us to study the Constitution, particularly the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment, he said, left a black stain on America. While slavery has been abolished, it has been allowed to continue by another name, the prison industrial complex. The 13th Amendment allows slavery and involuntary servitude as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. This exception, purposefully written to legitimize the use of convicted persons as slaves, and more importantly, is Section 2 of this amendment, which reads, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. The loophole in the 13th Amendment helps explain America's mass incarceration problem. Blacks are overrepresented in prisons. The 13th Amendment encourages the continued slavery of black people. And who profits from slavery? Not the slaves, rather those in power. Ultimately, the profits go to the criminal justice system. One African-American exoneree I interviewed for my upcoming book described his false imprisonment with me. With a soft voice, he told me that he had grown up to believe that slavery had ended. Once in prison, he became a slave just like his forefathers. Forced to work in a hot, open field picking corn, he said that nothing had really changed. Slavery is still alive and it's legal. If Dr. King was here today, he would surely agree with this exoneree's interpretation of legalized slavery and would fight against it, just as he fought against racial segregation and inequality. Dr. Salam shared another important message that Dr. King would remind us of today. That is, black and brown people have to prove their innocence in a court of law, while white people are innocent until proven guilty. There is no justice for Black America. Now let's get back to Dr. King's letter. In his letter, Dr. King wrote, and I quote, "Society must protect the robbed and punish the robber." This statement resonated with me. We must protect our marginalized population. America has the largest prison population in the world. African Americans continue to be overrepresented in every stage of the criminal justice process, from arrest to conviction, and they are also most likely to be wrongly convicted. The National Registry of Exonerations shared in their 2017 report that 47% of those who were exonerated based on factual innocence were African American. Keep in mind that African Americans make up 13% of the U.S. population, but make up 47% of the exonerations on the basis of innocence. So what does Dr. King's quote, "Society must protect the robbed and punish the robber," mean in terms of wrongful conviction? It means that we must protect African Americans from being wrongly targeted and punished for crimes that they did not commit. We, as a nation, must protect them from intentional and unintentional miscarriages of justice. We must be mindful not to blame them for their wrongful conviction. And for those who were finally exonerated, we must embrace them as we would any other victim. They have been robbed, years upon years stolen from them, and we must hold those responsible for causing their victimization. These are the criminal justice actors who robbed these innocent people of their freedom. Through their tunnel vision, their deceit, their power, and their ignorance, they created victims. Our exonerees have been disrespected, treated with indignity, and deserve more than we can offer. In fact, in Indiana, like most states, if you come out of prison a guilty person, the state offers you a parole officer to help you with reintegration. But if you come out of prison an innocent person, the state offers you no services. This must change. How do we, as a community, ensure that justice is applied fairly to all members of society? I would encourage you all to join me in being irate. Like Dr. King's interpretation of disobedience as not being a bad thing, irate does not have to be a bad thing either. It will bring about change. So what does irate represent? Irate, inform, reform, accountability, tolerance, engage. What do these words mean? I created this acronym because I often feel irate. And so I want to share with you what each of these letters represent. I stands for inform. Information is the key to change. Many people believe that the wrongly convicted must have done something wrong to have been incarcerated. This is simply not true. Educate yourselves. Read. Speak to those of us who work in this space. We can shed away the myths of wrongful convictions and share facts. Once you understand the myths, you may want to join me in getting irate. Reform. We must create policies and laws that will aid in reducing wrongful convictions. And when a wrongful conviction occurs, we must have bills to help those whose lives have been stolen. We must offer reparations to the exonerated and to their families. I mention families as they have also suffered. Parents, spouses, children, and others have been the forgotten victims who must also be recognized and offered reparations. Accountability. Today, our police are protected under qualified immunity, and our prosecutors are protected with absolute immunity. This must change. Recently, we have seen cases where police officers are being held accountable for their violence against innocent citizens. I hope that this is a sign that we, as a nation, will no longer tolerate police brutality. I believe that when any criminal justice actor behaves in a way that violates justice, he or she should be removed from that position. We cannot wait for another African American man or woman to die. Let's not afford bad police officers the opportunity to continue their abuse in our communities. And for the good criminal justice agents out there, I want to thank you. You can make a difference. My advice to police officers is do not be a silent bystander, be an upstander. An upstander is someone who recognizes when something is wrong and does something to make it right. Speak out against mistreatment and discrimination. When you see a fellow officer engage in bad behavior, report it. I know that that isn't easy, but you took an oath to uphold the law, so it is your responsibility to do so. If you don't, you are complicit in that bad behavior. And to the prosecutors out there, remember your job is to ensure that justice is served. That does not mean that you must win a case at any cost. What that means is that you prosecute the right person. Do your due diligence. And when you learn that the wrong person was prosecuted, you have a duty to get them out of prison and then to help them with reparations. T, tolerance. We must teach our children to value life and not judge others based on skin color, but on their character. Dr. King had a dream that we would recognize that all men and women are created equal, that his 4 children would be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. I have that same dream. Help us fulfill that dream. E, engage. Be an active participant in change. Martin Luther King Day is not a day to sit back and passively reflect, but it is a day for action. This is what is meant by Martin Luther King Day is a day on, not a day off. Engage in research, write to your legislators, speak out against racial discrimination, do something to be part of necessary change. We must come together as a nation to fight injustice and inequality. Get irate with me in honor of the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.